Okay, welcome to Chapter 7. We're halfway home as far as our chapters in our books. I hope everyone's been following along in the books. You've already had your first test. You have your second test coming up. Your first test will be pretty similar to your second. Your second test will be similar to your first test. It will focus on vocabulary, recognizing formulas, terms, outlooks, and other assumptions that we try to make in economics. So it'll be very similar. You'll have 48 hours to complete it just like you did before. If you didn't do well in your first test, please feel free to contact me. I always offer bonus points and other things that you can do to bring your grade up. Or if there was any confusion on it too, we can go over that as well. So always feel free to call me, text me, email me, whatever I can do to help you out, please let me know. So we'll move on to Chapter 7, halfway home, more than halfway actually. We're going to talk about how consumers, producers, and how they work with the efficiency of the market. So what do they do to work together? How do they work together? We're also, as far as what you'll be tested on and what you need to know, we're going to look at the link between the buyer's willingness to pay for a good and its demand curve. And also we're going to look at how to measure a consumer surplus. We'll look at the link between sales costs of producing a good and the supply curve, and we'll compare those two, and how to define and measure producer surplus. We'll again, of course, always look at the equilibrium of supply and demand, and how do we maximize it to create an efficient market. And we'll look for other ways to identify consumer surplus as well. So let's get started by defining and looking at the terms and the formulas that we use to make predictions and assumptions. First, let's talk about welfare economics. A lot of times students think when we talk about welfare economics that we're talking about subsidies or actual welfare, but that's not what we're looking for here. We're looking at economics and the welfare of economics and how do we keep a stable market. So welfare economics is the study of how allocations of resources affect the economic well-being. So what is the willingness to pay? How do we identify the willingness to pay? The book defines the willingness to pay is that the amount that a buyer will pay for a good and look into making a correct purchase so that they don't overpay. A definition of a consumer surplus is the amount a buyer is willing to pay for a good minus the amount the buyer actually pays for it. How can we use the demand curve to measure consumer surplus? As we know, as price falls, consumer surplus increases for two reasons. Those already buying the product will receive additional consumer surplus because they are paying less for the product than before. Second, because the price is now lower, some new buyers will enter the market and receive consumer surplus on the additional units of outputs purchased. So, what does consumer surplus measure? Remember that consumer surplus is the difference between the amount that a buyer is willing to pay for a good and the price that they actually already have paid. Thus, it measures the benefit that the consumer receives from the good as the buyers themselves perceive it. So a lot of times we talked about how economics is the consumer's perception, and also marketing and production has a lot of input on that as well. So, we've looked at the consumer surplus. Let's now look at the producer surplus. The main variables are what it is cost to produce and the willingness to sell. So, how do we define cost? The cost is the value the seller must give up to produce a good. So, what is producer surplus? It is the amount the seller is paid for a good minus the seller's cost of providing it. At any given time, the price given the supply curve represents the cost of the marginal seller. Because the supply curve shows the seller's cost and his willingness to pay, we can use the supply curve to measure the producer's surplus. Producer surplus can be measured as the area above the supply curve and below the price. So, how do higher prices raise producer surplus? As the price raises, producer surpluses increase for two reasons. Because we already know that those are already selling the product will receive additional producer surplus because they will receive more for the product than before. Second, because now there's more profit available, there's more market fluctuations, the price is now higher, so new sellers will enter the market and receive producer surplus on the additional units of the output sold before they were in the markets. So additional sellers into the market. Producer surplus is used to measure the economic well-being of producers, much like the consumer surplus is used to measure the economic well-being of consumers. So, how do we measure total market efficiency? The economy, the economic well-being of everyone in society can be measured by total surplus, which is the sum of consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So you should have a chart in your book or on your PowerPoint that shows that total surplus is equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And also that just, if you break it down even further, the total surplus is equal to the value to buyers minus the amount paid to buyers plus the amount received by sellers minus the cost to sellers. So, because of this amount paid by the buyers and the equal amount received by the sellers is how they will find the total market efficiency. So how do we define efficiency? How does the book define efficiency? Efficiency is a property of the resource allocation of maximizing the total surplus received by all members in society. So how do we define equality? Equality is the property of distributing the economic prosperity uniformly to all members of society. So if you see the one graph that we have, I believe it's called market equilibrium, it shows you that prices on the vertical axis, quantities on the horizontal axis. You see the price point, you see equilibrium, you can see the consumer surplus is above and the producer surplus is below. So when these assumptions do not hold the market equilibrium, it may not be efficient. When markets fail, our problems have for public policy sometimes can be put in place to remedy the situation. We've seen that with the government stepping into some businesses. Market efficiency and market failures don't always follow along the assumptions that we think that they're going to follow. But for the most part, we can make predictions. We can use historical data to find out what's happened in the past to be able to make assumptions and predictions in the future. So just remember to conclude that markets are efficient. We made several assumptions in this chapter, and then we have throughout the chapters that we're working with perfect markets and that they're efficient and that they all worked. Remember, we're not working in a monopoly, we're working in a perfectly competitive market, and there's no externalities, so no variables are coming into play. Okay, so to sum up chapter 7, and look into what we possibly would have on our test, are the part that I want you to know when you go out into the world or when you're doing your research. The two main things that we focused on: consumer surplus and producer surplus, and how it equilibriums in the market. Remember, consumer surplus equals buyers' willingness to pay for a good minus the amount that they actually pay. And it also measures the benefit buyers get from participating in the market. We know that good market activity will lead to a good market and good production, which will, in the end, help produce the GDP, or increase the GDP. If we're wanting to compute the consumer surplus, we look at the results on the graph by finding the area below the demand curve and above the price. I will not give you a set of data and ask you to find the actual equilibrium and actually find the prices, but I may give you a graph and ask you to identify the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So remember, consumer surplus can be computed by finding the area below the demand curve but above the price. Our second main focus of this chapter, producer surplus, which equals the amount the sellers receive for their goods minus the cost of production. And it also measures, just like consumer surplus, it also measures the benefits sellers get from participating in the market. Producer surplus can be computerized by finding the area below the price and above the supply curve. There's a chart and a graph that's in your PowerPoints and also in your textbook. There's a lot of other graphs in there as well, but I'm not wanting you to focus on those. I only want you to focus on that one. An allocation of resources that measure the sum of the consumer and the producer surplus is said to be efficient. Policymakers often are concerned with the efficiency as well as the equality of economic outcomes. The equilibrium of supply and demand maximizes the sum of the consumer and the producer's surplus. That's the invisible hand that we talked about in the marketplace, which can lead buyers and sellers to allocate resources efficiently. Markets do not allocate resources efficiently in the presence of market failures, such as a market power or externalities. So remember, total surplus is equal to the value of the buyers minus the cost to the sellers. When we talk about welfare economics, we're not talking about public assistance. We're talking about social well-being of the entire market, or the producers and the sellers. It's also important to know that the consumer surplus is measured in monetary terms. Consumer surplus gives us a way to place a monetary cost on inefficient market outcomes. This is often called due to government involvement and market failures. There are always circumstances when the market process does not lead to the most effective outcome. Market failures, you see it all the time, it's on the news quite often. These examples could include situations such as when a firm or a buyer has a market power over the price, that we will talk about in monopolies, or when the externalities are present. Those are the other variables and outliers that we also talked about. We will discuss these situations in later chapters. So as far as Chapter 7 is concerned, the main thing that I want you to focus on is consumer surplus and producer surplus, and the importance it has on the market and the roles that it plays on the market, but also how to identify them if you're looking at a graph. You won't have to figure the numbers out, but I do want you to be able to look at a graph and see when you do have a surplus and be able to identify if it's a producer surplus or a consumer surplus.